I drove home into my driveway and was met by three military tanks across my path, and Ela Thompson, our power-grabbing HOA president, with that smug smile on her face. But she never knew my dad as a lieutenant general and has the full force of the military behind him. What would you do if your neighborhood bully had finally messed with the wrong family? I spit out my coffee when I gazed through my front window. Three enormous green tanks stood in my driveway. Their gun barrels pointed straight at my front door. This wasn't a dream or a joke. Real military tanks stood between my car and freedom. What in the world? I swore, dropping my cup in the sink and running outside, still in my pajama pants, an old college t-shirt, the morning birds chirping cheerfully, entirely oblivious to war machines, destroying my otherwise normal Tuesday. I circled the first tank, tracing the cold metal edge with my fingertips. It looked real enough, dusty, enormous, and most certainly not where it belonged in my suburban driveway. A throat cleared behind me. I turned to see Elaine Thompson on my lawn clipboard, clutched to her chest, dressed in her signature pearls, and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good morning, James," she said, glancing at her watch. "I see you've seen our new enforcement policy." "Ela, what is this?" I waved wildly at the tanks. "How is this even possible?" She advanced, heels sinking slightly into my grass section. 7.4.2 of the Pinehurst Gardens Homeowners Association bylaws expressly states that all exterior decorations need to be approved by the Architectural Committee. I blinked at her. "What decorations?" Elaine pointed her pen towards my front yard, where balloons in bright colors and a happy birthday sign were suspended from my oak tree. "Those unauthorized decorations were put up yesterday at about 4:37 p.m. They from my daughter's birthday party this weekend," I said, my voice rising. "They'll be gone by Monday. Rules are rules, James." Her smile broadened as she thumbed through her clipboard. "The violation comes with a $2,500 fine due immediately. Until then, these tanks remain right here." I laughed, certain this had to be some sort of elaborate joke. "You can't be serious. How did you even acquire military tanks?" "My cousin Marcus works at military surplus auctions," she said proudly. "The HOA board voted unanimously last night to buy these for enforcement purposes." "This is ridiculous," I said, pulling out my phone. "I'm calling the police, feel free." Elaine inspected her immaculate manicure. "Sheriff Daniel serves on our board. He has already signed this measure. It's perfectly legal." My phone vibrated in my hand, text from my father arriving early ETA. "Your house 3 p.m. Can't wait to see my granddaughter, Dad." My stomach sank. Dad was arriving today, not Saturday. Lieutenant General William Taylor, decorated combat veteran and current Deputy Commander of Forces Command, was coming in 6 hours to discover tanks in front of his son's house. "Look, Elaine," I attempted to reason. "My father is coming today. He's a high-ranking military officer. This isn't going to look good." Something flashed in her eyes, uncertainty, perhaps, before her mask of authority slipped back. "Then you should pay your fine. Soon the HOA office opens at 9. She handed me a pink violation notice and turned away, her attitude impeccable, her triumph absolute. I stood there observing her leave, the inanity of it all seeping in 3 tanks in my driveway. Due to birthday decorations, my neighbor Tom Jackson stood alongside me, coffee mug in hand. "Holy cow, James, she's lost it now." "You think I pointed at the tanks? They've been getting worse." Tom said softly. "Last month, they fined me $500 for wind chimes when I grumbled. They cut down my maple tree, sending a crew saying it was diseased." "What, that tree was healthy?" Tom nodded sternly. "It was also obstructing Elaine's view of the lake from her home office." I felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the morning air. "This isn't just about rules, is it?" "It hasn't been for a long time." Tom agreed. "Come in here. I need to demonstrate something." In Tom's dining room, his computer showed spreadsheets and documents, years' worth of HOA financials. "I've been monitoring this since they more than tripled our dues," Tom said, gesturing to suspicious charges. "See here, $300 collected in violation fees more than 2 years. And here, landscaping enhancements costing $87,000 to one property." "Let me guess, I told Elaine's house." Tom nodded. "She has been treating the HOA like her own piggy bank, and whoever dares question it all of a sudden gets buried under violations." As Tom browsed additional evidence, the whirring in the distance of helicopter rotors grew louder. We went outside to observe a military helicopter hovering overhead, way earlier than we had anticipated. My phone was ringing Dad's number. Son, his voice was distinguishable over the background noise. There seemed to be tanks in your driveway. Care to explain before I could respond? Tom grabbed my arm, gesturing down the street where Elaine was shepherded. Driveway still in pajama pants, James, he said, welcoming me briefly. Interesting welcome committee you've organized, not precisely my doing, I said hastily, telling him about Elaine and the HOA's new enforcement strategies. Dad's face was bland, but I knew the deadly glint in his eyes. So these tanks came out because of birthday decorations for my granddaughter? Apparently, he nodded once Colonel Rivera, he called over his shoulder. Would you please test these vehicles? The woman colonel walked up to the closest tank, going around it with interest, a professional wanting my M60 patent. She declared decommissioned but not demilitarized serial number identifies one that was reported missing from Fort Benning surplus yard yesterday. A hush fell over the crowd as Elaine made her way forward. What's going on here? This is private HOA business. Dad turned around to confront her. I'm Lieutenant General William Taylor, United States Army, and you are Elaine, stood up straight, obviously intimidated, but not going to admit it. Elaine Thompson, head of the Pinnerest Gardens Homeowners Association. These cars were purchased legally via surplus auction. Fascinating, Dad answered, because by Colonel Rivera's account they matched the description and serial numbers of military equipment stolen yesterday. Military equipment that never made it to any legal auction? Impossible, Elaine sputtered. Marcus told me Marcus Reynolds is now in the process of being interrogated by military investigators. Dad cut in stealing government property is a federal crime, with severe consequences. Murmurs circulated among the increasing crowd of witnesses. I saw Tom sneaking between homes with his laptop, revealing something to small clusters who responded in shock. Elaine's face had paled. I am confident there has been a mistake if these cars are government property. We'll definitely comply with their removal, how much Dad said with a dry tone. Colonel, please, organize transport as Colonel Rivera placed calls. Dad turned to speak to the assembled neighbors as we wait. I wonder about this HOA that employs military gear to enforce birthday decoration regulations. Does anyone have anything they'd like to discuss? It was like a dam breaking. Voices came from everywhere. They fined me $1,000 for planting unauthorized flowers. My fence was 1 in 2 high, and they billed me $350 a day until I had it repaired. They towed my son's vehicle because it had a university sticker, and they didn't authorize. Elaine attempted to take control of the situation again. These are all infractions of our bylaws that everyone signed when they bought property. Here, actually. Tom's voice escalated ahead of the rest as he emerged with his laptop. Many of these alleged infractions aren't even in the original bylaws. The board has been imposing new regulations without the 75% homeowner approval necessary. More voices added to the chorus of grievances. Sandra Morgan, a 3 doors down accountant, broke through the crowd. I've been going over the financial statements Tom compiled. She declared the HOA collected $37,500 in fines last month, but only $3,200 is found in the official books. Where's the rest? Elaine's husband Douglas materialized at her elbow. Suddenly, this is harassment. We have a right to enforce community standards. Not with stolen equipment from the military, Dad answered reasonably, and perhaps not with fraudulent accounting methods either. Military transport vehicles rolled up to prepare to haul off the tanks. The sheriff's car came up, and Sheriff Daniels walked out looking puzzled at the Army presence. General Taylor, Dad, were recovering stolen Army property and perhaps revealing financial fraud in your HOA. I recognize you're a member of the board. The sheriff's face went from puzzled to worried. I only go to meetings every now and then, but I'm not present when the finances are decided. Intriguing, Dad said, as a number of homeowners said that you personally approved the use of these tanks in HOA enforcement. Sheriff Daniels eyed Elaine in increasing distress. I did no such thing. Mrs. Thompson informed the board you had sanctioned this as a community protest. All attention shifted to Elaine, whose demeanor finally broke. This is absurd. You can't simply walk in here. And her words cut short as a man in a suit emerged from one of the new arrivals. Mrs. Thompson, I'm Special Agent Harris, FBI. We'd like to ask you some questions regarding HOA finances and possibly fraudulent activity, observing Elaine being led to the agent's car. I experienced a strange sense of satisfaction and discomfort. The tanks were being loaded onto transporters. Neighbors were trading contact information and organizing groups. And Dad was chatting with officials, James Tom called, calling me over to where he was standing with some of the neighbors. We're organizing a nighttime emergency HOA meeting with what's going on. We could quite possibly have enough votes to get rid of the board. Count me in. I added, turning to go back inside, and at last, out of my pajamas, Douglas Thompson stood. It's a threat. Check your boundaries, James. I'm sure that pricey garage of yours encroaches on the setback by no less than 2 feet. County regulators would have a field day here. As he moved away, my fleeting triumph faded. What had looked like an easy victory was turning out to be a lot more complicated. I looked around at my neighbors still toasting their perceived freedom. How many of them had renovations that wouldn't pass inspection? How many had been held in check not only by fear of Elaine's penalties, but by her discretionary enforcement that shielded them from larger authorities? Dad came over having changed into civilian attire. Son, I believe this one runs deeper than pilfered tanks. Your HOA has apparently been operating quite a business. I'm coming to understand that I mentioned observing Douglas whispering among small groups of suddenly fretful, appearing neighbors. The question now, Dad said, looking where I did, is, if deposing a tyrant may inadvertently set the village on fire. The emergency HOA meeting was at 7 p.m. as news spread around Pinehurst Gardens. I couldn't help but wonder whether we were on the path to freedom or anarchy. The chopping sound of helicopter blades through the air caused every inhabitant of Pinehurst Gardens to raise their heads. My dad's army chopper landed in the vacant lot behind our community center, prompting gasps from surrounding neighbors who had congregated to observe our confrontation. They summoned the army. Mrs. Rodriguez breathed under her clutches. Gardening gloves, I experienced a combination of relief and shame. Not quite. That's my dad. Lieutenant General James Harrington emerged dressed in his full uniform stars, shining brightly in the sunlight. 2 military police officers escorted him, accompanied by a woman in a business suit with a briefcase. Your father is General Harrington. Tom Jackson's jaw dropped. The man who commanded the peacekeeping mission in. Yes, I interrupted, not wishing to make this more dramatic than it already was, but he's just Dad to me. Elaine Thompson walked towards my dad, with her shoulders set, followed by her husband Douglas and the HOA treasurer, Gerald Wilson. I raced across the lawn to get to them before she could. Dad, I'm sorry about this. I didn't mean for you to get involved in. He hugged me fast. No one messes with my kid's birthday party afterwards. His face became stern as he examined the tanks. These cars seem familiar. Elaine pushed her hand out. General, I'm Elaine Thompson, president of Pinehurst Gardens Homeowners Association. This is a private neighborhood issue that doesn't need military involvement. Dad ignored her hand. Instead, he circled the first tank, tracing his fingers over the serial number on its side. He pulled out his phone, snapped a photo, and took a text: 3 decommissioned M60 patents with proper permits, transport clearance, or demilitarization certificates. He explained, his voice changing to what I refer to as his commander tone, standing behind him. Colonel Rivera and the soldiers, police officers, spreading out around the tanks. This is private property, Elaine objected, her voice rising as our neighbors closed in around us. Dad smiled, the same smile I knew from news reports of his diplomatic visits. In fact, these cars are still property of the United States government. They were stolen from Fort Benning yesterday. Elaine went white. Marcus assured them they were bought legally. Marcus Reynolds is now detailing his methods of acquisition to federal investigators. Dad responded, looking at his phone as it vibrated with a message. His story is constantly changing, but stealing military property is a federal crime. Regardless, Douglas Thompson approached. Now, hold on a minute. We have receipts for an honest purchase from the woman in the business suit. Opened her briefcase and gave my father a document. Sir, the paperwork from Fort Benning, affirming these cars were never decommissioned for sale to civilians. Who are you? Elaine insisted. Special Agent Keller, Department of Defense, Criminal Investigation Division, she answered, flashing her badge. We've been following these cars since they vanished, neighbors muttered and pointed phones at the scene. Someone was live streaming. Take these cars away from my daughter's property. Right now, Dad commanded his tone, allowing no argument for argument. Gerald Wilson, normally so self-assured at HOA meetings, appeared to be on the verge of fainting. Mrs. Thompson, well, maybe we ought to just quiet down. Gerald, Elaine hissed, and then to my dad, this is still a breach of HOA regulations, the decorations. Dad interrupted her. Now let us talk about the actual issue here. Your systematic taking advantage of homeowners? His words hung in the air as neighbors murmured in support. I stepped up for months. The HOA has been singling out certain homeowners with unreasonable fines and selective enforcement. We've recorded at least 37 cases. Tom Jackson opened his laptop and displayed Agent Keller and my father, the spreadsheet we'd compiled of complaints. The neighborhood had assembled recounting tales of HOA abuses. Mrs. Rodriguez explained how she'd received a $500 fine for putting tomatoes in her backyard garden. The Wilsons had almost lost their house when the HOA put a lien for unpaid fines on a fence that was 2 inches taller than code. When the final tank was filled, Elaine stood alone on the edge of my lawn. Her supporters had disappeared once the tide turned. For the first time, I saw something I hadn't expected to see, fear in her eyes. Agent Keller approached me as Dad oversaw the tank removal. We'll require statements from everyone regarding the HOA's actions. This can extend beyond mere mismanagement. What do you mean? I asked. She hushed her voice. Financial records tend to tell patterns. If your HOA president is willing to utilize stolen military gear for a personal vendetta, what else can she be capable of? As Elaine stalked off in the direction of her house, neighbors started mobilizing around us, exchanging phone numbers, and promising to come to the emergency HOA meeting. Scheduled for that night, Dad slung his arm around my shoulders. Not quite how I'd envisioned spending my visit, but I'm proud of you for sticking up to a bully. I learned from the best, I said. What none of us realized, though, was that Elaine Thompson wasn't backing down. She was repositioning, and the papers she was hurrying home to shred would alter all there is to know about our peaceful neighborhood. For all-time Pinehurst Gardens, community center swarmed with bitter voices. I never knew. So many neighbors at the same time beforehand. The emergency HOA meeting was standing room only, wall-to-wall, filled with homeowners clutching documents and phones. Some sporting t-shirts hurriedly printed on a card that said, "Stop HOA Abuse." Elaine Thompson occupied the center table with the other board members. 2 chairs were empty. Gerald Wilson and Marcus Reynolds had conspicuously called in sick. Douglas Thompson paced behind his wife, quietly talking to her as she manipulated papers. I call this emergency meeting to order, Elaine boomed, banging her gavel 3 times, her voice cracking slightly. First item of business, point of order. Sandra Morgan rose up from the front row. Sandra was a retired accountant that had assisted me in filing the financial reports that we'd collected from neighbors. In a manner consistent with our bylaws, members can place emergency items on the agenda with 10 supporting signatures. I have 47. Elaine's knuckles whitened around her gavel. What items? Financial audit, vote of no confidence, board replacement. Sandra's words dropped like bombs in the silent room. That's not how this works. Douglas cut across the board, sets the agenda. Actually, it is how it works. Gregory Wilson rose to his feet, leaning on his cane. The retired judge commanded immediate respect. I've read the bylaws carefully. Section 12, paragraph 4 reads the procedure Miss Morgan is going through. I sat between my father and Agent Keller, who had remained to monitor Dad, bent over. Impressive organizing in such brief time. We've been constructing this case for months. I breathed back, just needed the right moment. Elaine tried to keep things under control, but the momentum had obviously shifted. Find 10 minutes for your so-called audit presentation. Sandra plugged her laptop into the projector. Spreadsheets covered the screen. I've broken down 3 years of financial records homeowners were entitled to under law but kept from accessing the room. Was quiet as she scrolled through the slides. Financial records reveal $87,000 of landscaping improvements to one property in the last year, she declared, pointing out a line item. That property is owned by Elaine Thompson. A map came up with before and after satellite views of Elaine's backyard makeover, complete with pool, outdoor kitchen, and cabana. in addition to $42,000 for street improvements that never came to be $35,000 for community functions, that were in fact private parties at board members' residences, and most troubling, $156,000 deposited into a different account named Reserve Management that doesn't show up anywhere in official HOA documents. Chaos broke out, neighbors stood up on their feet yelling questions and accusations. Pictures of Elaine's property improvements went around phones. Those improvements were sanctioned by the board, Elaine yelled above the commotion. A board made up of your husband, your brother-in-law, and your college buddy. Someone screamed back when Elaine attempted to close the meeting by pounding her gavel over and over. Gregory Wilson stood again. Per HOA bylaws, members may vote to have board officers removed with a 2/3 majority, he announced, his judicial voice above the din. We have prepared ballots. 2 neighbors passed out papers to all property owners with addresses. I explained the voting process to an elderly couple. I've been here 15 years and didn't know we could do this, Mrs. Peterson informed me, her hands shaking as she filled out her ballot. That's how they remained in office, I explained. Elaine grabbed the collection box and knocked it over. This meeting is unauthorized, she yelled, ballots spilling everywhere on the floor. Neighbors scrambled to gather the papers, shielding them from Elaine's outstretched hands. My father positioned himself between her and an old man. She almost pushed over Mrs. Thompson. Calm down, Dad instructed sternly. Then the doors to the community center swung open, and Sheriff Daniels entered along with 2 deputies. The room grew quiet. Mrs. Thompson, we have some questions regarding unauthorized access of HOA funds, the sheriff declared. We've gotten some troubling paperwork from the County Financial Crimes Division. Elaine's face twisted with anger. This is a trap. You're all envious of what we've created here. I moved forward. No, Elaine, we simply want our neighborhood back, just as victory was in sight. Douglas Thompson jumped onto a chair, his face flushed with anger. If my wife falls, everyone does, he bellowed, pulling out a thick folder from his briefcase. We've got dirt on all of you. He tossed papers into the air. Check your property lines we've been selectively enforcing for years. Half your renovations are illegal according to county code. He pointed at different neighbors. Johnson, your deck is 6 inches over the setback line. Rodriguez, your fence encroaches on. Common area. Peterson, your garage conversion never had permits. The mood in the room changed immediately from indignant fury to panic. Neighbors rushed around gathering papers, hoping to find their names and property. Sheriff Daniels indicated his deputies should restore order. That's all, Mr. Thompson. But the harm was done. Neighbors who had been in unison moments earlier now looked at one another distrustfully, wondering whose issues could influence property values. Dad put his hand on my shoulder. This is a tried and true divide and conquer strategy. Agent Keller nodded, and regretfully, effective. I stood by and watched as Elaine was led out for interrogation, but instead of victory, I felt fear we'd won the battle, but maybe lost the war that could destroy our community. Sandra Morgan came over to me, her earlier confidence shaken. What do we do now if Douglas is correct about the code? In fractions before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a message from Tom Jackson. Emergency county inspectors just showed up at my residence. They're threatening condemnation of the sunroom, glancing around at my terrorized neighbors. I knew this battle was hardly won. Elaine may be going to justice, but her going away present was appalling, destroying neighbors to enemies overnight. What would it take to preserve our homes when the foundation of trust had been broken? Sirens blared as 3 vans belonging to the county inspector arrived at Pinnerus Gardens. At 7 a.m. sharp, my coffee cup almost fell from my hands. This was not in the plan. They are beginning with the Petersons. Mrs. Morgan phoned, racing across my lawn in her bathrobe. Michael is having a total meltdown. I rushed over just in time to witness an inspector slapping a bright red notice on the Petersons' lovely sunroom, the one they constructed for their daughter's wedding last year. Unauthorized building has to be torn down within 30 days, the inspector declared coldly, not even glancing at Michael's shaking hands. But we had HOA approval. Michael yelled, brandishing a paper. We paid the fees. HOA approval is not county approval, the inspector responded. Someone made an anonymous complaint regarding several properties in this area. My stomach fell. Someone. I didn't take 3 guesses until noon. 5 families had had demolition orders. 12 others had heavy fines. The Wilsons' deck, the Taylor's fence, The Rodriguez family's handicap ramp for their grandmother. Suddenly illegal. You stirred up the bear, hissed Catherine Taylor, tears streaming down her face. $8,000 worth of fines we can't pay. We were okay until you began this war. I wanted to tell you that Elaine's abuse of power had to end, but the words caught in my throat as I saw the Rodriguez family wheeling their grandmother down their front porch because they couldn't anymore use their ramp. Dad discovered me sitting on my porch steps observing neighbors fight in the street. This isn't what victory should feel like. I whispered. He sat next to me, his uniform replaced by civilian clothing. In war, even just wars, there's always collateral damage. The question is whether you're fighting for something worth the price. I thought I was fighting for justice, but now I wasn't ensuring that afternoon. 47 neighbors were officially notified regarding infractions. The community pool unauthorized growth, the playground improper construction, the walking trails incorrect materials as the sun was setting. I discovered an unmarked envelope in my mailbox. Within was a detailed map of Pinehurst Gardens properties, with red circles drawn around dozens of properties, including mine. A yellow sticky note stated, "You're next, E." I called for an emergency community meeting in my living room. There were only 12 people who came. Put forward at the HOA meeting, Elaine's husband is an employee of the county planning department, revealed Mrs. Morgan in a hushed tone. This is just the tip of the iceberg. The Jacksons, once my most staunch supporters, wouldn't even look me in the eye. We can't risk losing our home. Tom said we've decided to pay the fines and apologize to Elaine one at a time. Neighbors confessed they were backing down. The stakes were too high. Houses they'd worked years to save, to purchase renovations that were their dreams. All on a thread, we must battle this together. I insisted if we all stand, you have a military father who can bail you out, snapped Michael Peterson. The rest of us are ordinary people with ordinary jobs and ordinary savings accounts. The meeting concluded with no solution as neighbors filed out. Mrs. Morgan handed me a thick folder. County records, she explained. I did some research. Pinehurst Gardens was constructed on old wetlands that were never drained properly. The developer cut corners everywhere. That's why so many houses have foundation problems. I spent all night reading through the papers. The original contractor had bribed officials to accept subpar work when the scam was uncovered. The developer sold the property to the HOA, making all of us liable at dawn. A certified letter arrived. The county was examining Pinehurst Gardens, whole zoning compliance. We had 90 days to fix all violations or risk condemnation proceedings. My phone rang. It was Elaine, willing to surrender. She asked sweetly, "I hear moving vans are discounting this month. Why are you doing this?" I demanded. "You live here too." "Not for long," she replied. "Douglas and I are selling developers, paying a nice commission to help clear out these properties." The line went dead. I stared at the phone. My mind racing. Builder clear out. Digging through Mrs. Morgan's papers again. I discovered it. Property transfer documents indicating a company named Evergreen Development, buying repossessed houses in Pinehurst Gardens. The same company that initially constructed our faulty houses 15 years prior. They weren't just punishing us, they were attempting to drive us out completely. But why my doorbell rang outside stood a small group of stubborn neighbors, such as the Morgans, the Rodriguezes, and to our surprise, Judge Wilson. "We discovered something you should see," said the judge, spreading out architectural drawings on my dining table. "The wetlands under Pinehurst Gardens, they're perched on one of the state's largest untapped freshwater springs." Suddenly, it all made sense. This wasn't about lawn gnomes or tanks or even HOA authority. This was about water liquid gold in our arid state. "We have to bring out this," I said, "but before that, we must speak to the only person who knows all their secrets." "Who?" asked Mrs. Morgan. I grabbed my car keys. "I'm going to locate Elaine Thompson." "Where is she?" I hammered on Douglas Thompson's door. Rain permeating through my jacket. 3 hours of searching, and Elaine had disappeared from her accustomed places. Douglas opened the door, his face haggard. "She's gone. Packed a bag this morning after some call from Evergreen Development." I showed him the architectural plans. "Did you know about this? The freshwater spring under our homes?" His eyes widened. "She never said then." His expression hardened. "Check the old clubhouse. She stores her private files there." Lightning flashed as I picked the lock on the empty building. Cobwebs draped over dusty chairs, but one filing cabinet appeared recently used. Searching for these, Elaine's voice startled me. She was standing in the doorway, rain dripping off of her designer coat, holding a fat folder. "How much are they paying you to ruin our neighborhood?" I insisted 5 million. She replied briefly enough to begin again. "Somewhere that people don't despise me. People despise what you've done, not who you are." I said, "And what about everybody else? Our homes, our savings?" Elaine slammed the folder onto the table. "I didn't initiate this war. I took it over." She told me how she learned the truth 3 years ago. The freshwater spring, the developer intend to redevelop the land, the structural flaws intentionally concealed during building. I thought if I kept everything in perfect order, had everyone do every rule, they wouldn't scrutinize the foundation so closely. She conceded, "Then you came over with your perfect lawn and your general father, and your questions about where HOA funds go. So you parked tanks in my driveway?" I panicked, she said softly. The developer threatened to reveal my involvement. If I did not assist clear the neighborhood, the folder held everything: emails, bank transfers, inspection bribes, incriminating evidence against Evergreen Development County officials, and yes, against Elaine herself. Why display me this now? Her eyes locked onto mine because they're arriving tomorrow to sample the water quality. Once they verify the spring, they will condemn every house, no matter code violations. It's done. I took the folder. Not yet, it isn't dawn. Discovered me in Judge Wilson's living room with Dad Doe. Against them. Judge Wilson nodded. "I've called every media outlet in the state. They'll be here when the water quality inspectors get here." That's not enough. Douglas interrupted. "My wife might have made awful decisions, but she's correct about one thing. These homes have serious structural problems." Dad smiled. "That's why I arranged for some favors for military transport trucks rolled into Pinehurst Gardens at 9 a.m. Sharp, not carrying tanks this time, but engineers, soil specialists, and construction experts. Lieutenant General Mitchell, sir," saluting my dad, a young captain, environmental assessment team standing by, as requested news trucks parked along the road, cameras snapping away as the water inspectors made their entrance, flabbergasted by the armed guards. "What are they doing here?" asked a man in a sleek suit stepping out of a black SUV. The Evergreen Development symbol shone brightly on his briefcase. Mrs. Morgan stood forward, microphones recording her voice. "We are carrying out an extensive environmental and structural evaluation of Pinehurst Gardens, chronicling the impact of illegal construction methods and deliberate environmental pollution by Evergreen Development 15 years ago." His face pad, "That's defamation." "You have no evidence." I stood up Ela's folder. "We have evidence of bribes, rigged inspections, and your proposed scheme to create a crisis in order to regain this land due to its water resources." The standoff took hours. Military engineers examined soil foundations. Water quality news teams questioned neighbors concerning HOA abuses and unexplained county violations. By afternoon, state environmental regulators had descended. Tipped off by the media frenzy, the Attorney General's office dispatched representatives. What had started as a residential conflict had escalated into a statewide scandal. "Where's Elaine in all this?" I asked Douglas as we stood watching officials huddled by the community pond. "Turning state's evidence," he replied softly. "Judge Wilson brokered a deal, full cooperation for immunity. 3 weeks of investigations ensued. Evergreen CEO was indicted, 2 county commissioners resigned. The water spring was confirmed a pristine source potentially worth millions, but now guarded by emergency environmental policy, preventing construction. The governor himself arrived to make a statement on a special recovery plan for Pinehurst Gardens. Low-risk loans for repair, accelerated permits, and a grant to adequately capture and preserve the spring water as a community resource. The most surprising moment was when Elaine came back standing uncomfortably in front of a neighborhood meeting. "I don't expect forgiveness," she started, "but I'd like to assist repair." What I assisted dismantle, rebuilding wasn't simple. Some neighbors departed, not willing to pardon. Others remained, but kept their distance. The labor was difficult, excavating terrible foundations, fixing drainage problems, rebuilding to code. 6 months since the tanks obstructed my driveway. I stood alongside Dad, observing volunteers elevate the structure for the new Rodriguez family ramp. "You know what amazes me?" Dad replied. "Not that you beat up on the HOA or revealed the developers." "What then?" He gestured toward where Elaine was measuring lumber, safely working among people who once hated her, that you were able to conquer without killing your foe. That's the toughest triumph of all. I watched while Michael Peterson, who once blamed me for everything, gave Elaine a bottle of water, not friends yet, but neighbors. Once more the tanks had come to enforce arbitrary rules, but had instead triggered a struggle for our community's soul. In the most bizarre turn of all, those great war machines had ultimately led, not to devastation, but to truth and grudging reconciliation. As I assisted in building a wall for the community center that would stand at Summit our spring, I realized that some fights aren't fought or won or lost, but are about learning what to fight for in the first phase.